In the dead of winter, 1887, a single photograph landed on the desk of a Charleston courthouse clerk. A haunting image that would unravel one of the darkest secrets in Appalachian history. It showed 17 barefoot children standing in the snow outside a collapsing cabin deep in the hollows of West Virginia. Their eyes were empty, their bodies skeletal. But what truly horrified investigators were the iron shackles around their ankles and the chilling fact that the Greylock family officially had only 4 children. The other 13 didn't exist on any record. No birth certificates, no church logs, nothing. They had been erased, denied, hidden by an entire community that refused to speak. Before we go deeper into the horror buried in Bone Creek Hollow, subscribe and hit the bell because this is one of the darkest stories America tried to forget. And drop your state in the comments. Let's see how far these shadows reach. That photo was just the beginning. What followed was the unraveling of a secret child labor system so carefully hidden, it endured for generations. Bone Creek Hollow was a place carved into the mountains like a scar that refused to heal. In 1887, the valley was a world apart, cut off by treacherous mountain trails and winters that swallowed travelers whole. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, was 27 miles away over deer paths known to vanish in a snowstorm. Within this forgotten slice of America, families lived by their own rules, bound by blood silence and the unspoken law that what happened in the hollow stayed in the hollow. The Greylocks had ruled this world since 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock brought his wife and 6 children through the Cumberland Gap. Unlike those chasing gold or new beginnings, Jeremiah sought isolation and power. The hollow gave him everything: fresh water, fertile land, endless woods, and most importantly, total freedom from law, church, or neighbor. By 1887, his grandson Ezekiel had built something far more sinister than a homestead. He commanded not just his family, but a hidden network of kin, hired hands, and what the records politely called Ward's children. No one questioned, tracked, or protected. Ezekiel ruled the hollow like a sovereign. Tall and wiry, with winter-colored eyes, he played the part of a mountain simpleton. But behind the patched clothes was a strategist who had mastered control through fear, isolation, and manipulation. His wife Martha, once Martha Kellerman of a nearby hollow, had hardened into something cold and immovable over 30 years of mountain silence. Their 4 registered children reflected this cruelty. 19-year-old Samuel was cold and calculating like his father. Rebecca, 17, hid her malice behind quiet glares and manipulative charm. The youngest twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, just 14, had already learned to obey every command and never speak of what they saw. But those 4 were only the surface. Beneath them lay the real engine of the Greylocks' power, children brought in under false promises, stripped of identity, and used as expendable labor. In an age when child death was common, records were unreliable, and neighbors minded their business, the Greylocks discovered they could build their own invisible empire. The method was brutal in its simplicity. In winter, starving families from nearby hollows would approach Ezekiel, asking him to take their children in a practice called binding out, supposedly in exchange for food, shelter, and education. But once those children crossed into Bone Creek Hollow, they vanished from the world. Their families were told they'd moved on, gotten work in distant towns, found better lives. In truth, they were imprisoned, exploited, and erased. No one came looking, no one dared, and the mountains kept their secrets. Other children arrived through even darker means. Orphans from failed homesteads, abandoned infants left at remote churches, and the forgotten sons and daughters of miners lost to cave-ins or disease. These children found their way to the Greylock family through a hidden pipeline fed by corrupt county clerks, traveling preachers with flexible morals, and neighbors willing to trade silence for coin. By the winter of 1887, this machinery of exploitation had been running smoothly for over 20 years. Official records listed just 6 members in the Greylock household. But in truth, 21 souls lived on that land. 17 of them existed in a parallel reality of grueling labor. Meager food and punishment so cruel they would shock even the hardened survivors of the Appalachian frontier. The photograph that would ultimately pierce this veil of secrecy was never meant to expose anything. In December 1887, a traveling photographer named Henry Peaton was moving through the mountain towns, offering portraits for 50 cents, a rare and treasured chance for isolated families to capture their lives. While in Cedar Ridge, he heard whispers about the Greylocks, a prosperous mountain family who always paid in cash, harvested unusually large yields, and remained curiously self-sufficient despite their remoteness. Intrigued and hoping for a lucrative commission, Peaton braved the icy trails and reached Bone Creek Hollow on December 15th. What he found defied everything he expected of backwoods life. The Greylock homestead wasn't a primitive log cabin, but a small compound of finely crafted buildings surrounding a central yard. The main house, made of expertly hewn chestnut logs, boasted glass windows, multiple rooms, and a solid stone chimney. Nearby stood a large barn, several outbuildings, craft workshops, and most strangely long dormitory-style structures that looked more like institutional housing than family quarters. But it was the children that unsettled Peaton most. Ezekiel proudly introduced his 4 official children dressed neatly and behaving with the strict, quiet obedience of those raised under hard rules. Yet as Peaton prepared his equipment in the courtyard, he began to notice others. Pale, thin children darted between buildings, like ghosts vanishing into shadows whenever he turned to look. Their clothing was ragged, their movements too quiet, too alert, like animals trained to avoid detection. When Peaton casually mentioned the other children, Ezekiel's response was polished and plausible. They were hired help orphans, taken in through Christian charity. Distant cousins helping with winter work, nothing unusual for a remote, self-sustaining homestead. The story fit, on paper, but the illusion shattered in a single moment. As Peaton positioned his camera, a disturbance erupted from one of the outbuildings. Shouts, hurried footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of chains clanging against wood. Several of the shadow children suddenly stumbled into the courtyard, and for the first time, Peaton got an unfiltered look. These were not hired children or distant kin. These were skeletal figures, their eyes void of life, their clothes threadbare and barely clinging to their frames. And around their ankles, catching the sharp winter sun, were iron shackles joined by chains just long enough for walking, but not for escape. That moment, frozen in Peaton's mind more vividly than any photograph he would ever take, revealed the truth behind the Greylock's mountain empire. And it would mark the beginning of the end for the family that had ruled Bone Creek Hollow in silence and shadow. Martha Greylock's voice cracked through the icy air like a whip, her scream laced with the kind of cruelty honed over decades. Samuel and Rebecca sprang into action, their movements precise, practiced, and utterly merciless as they drove the escaping children back with leather straps. Ezekiel's genial facade evaporated. In its place emerged something far colder, a man of brutal command barking orders to restrain the workers and restore discipline. But in the middle of the chaos, Henry Peaton's instincts took over. His camera, already set for the family portrait, stood ready. Without thinking, he triggered the shutter. The result, a single image that froze 17 barefoot children in time standing in the snow, shackled wide-eyed with terror. It was an image that would come to define the dark heart of Bone Creek Hollow. Ezekiel immediately realized the danger. He demanded the photographic plate, his tone now stripped of pleasantries. But Peaton, calm under fire, claimed the exposure had failed and that he needed to reshoot. As Ezekiel watched closely, Peaton played along, swapping out the plate, pretending to reset, while quietly hiding the incriminating one. He then took a second portrait, this time capturing only the 4 official Greylock children posed in front of the house, the image Ezekiel expected and accepted. That evening, Piton left Bone Creek Hollow with 2 plates. One depicted the respectable mountain family carefully curated for the public eye. The other held a truth so horrific, it would sear itself into his memory forever. 3 days later, in a hotel room in Cedar Ridge, Piton developed the photographs. When the image of those 17 shackled children emerged from the chemicals, he felt their hollow eyes staring through him, accusing, pleading, demanding justice. But justice in 1888 West Virginia was neither simple nor guaranteed. Photography was still distrusted in many rural communities. Child labor was common, barely regulated. Informal adoptions were routine, and the line between hard discipline and criminal abuse blurred under the weight of local custom. And then, there was the power of reputation, especially the reputation of white landowners like Ezekiel Greylock, whose word would outweigh that of an outsider with a camera. Piton faced a terrible choice: stay silent and carry the weight of what he'd seen, or risk his career safety and credibility to expose a truth the world might refuse to believe. For weeks, he was paralyzed. The photo remained locked in his studio safe, seen by no one but him. He made quiet inquiries, tested the waters. What he discovered chilled him. Ezekiel's reach extended beyond the hollow. The Greylocks weren't just isolated predators, they were protected. When Piton finally brought the photo to local authorities in Charleston, the reaction was cautious at best. Sheriff James Rutledge heard him out, but offered little more than bureaucratic shrugs. The terrain was too rugged, the Greylocks too entrenched. And Rutledge, as it turned out, knew Ezekiel well. The patriarch had assisted law enforcement on multiple occasions and was considered a reliable informant, an unsettling fact that hinted at deeper complicity. Determined not to let the matter die, Piton began his own investigation. Over the following months, he unearthed disturbing evidence that Bone Creek Hollow was just one node in a much larger system. Court records revealed Ezekiel's name linked to dozens of child placement arrangements spanning 15 years, cases that had slipped through the cracks of an already fragile legal system. What Piton had stumbled upon wasn't just a single family's crime. It was the scaffolding of institutional exploitation hidden in plain sight, propped up by silence, convenience, and the indifference of those who should have known better. Ezekiel Greylock frequently appeared before judges to formalize the adoption or apprenticeship of orphan children, always presenting proper paperwork and respectable intentions. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, documents were in order, and his stated purpose was to provide care and education. But when Henry Piton tried to follow up on these placements, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. The children simply vanished from the records. No future census entries, no marriage certificates, no burial notices, nothing. It was as if they had ceased to exist. Digging deeper, Piton made an even more unsettling discovery. Several county officials, including 2 judges and a court clerk, had received sizable loans from Ezekiel during times of financial strain. These debts forged a quiet loyalty, ensuring that no serious legal challenges would ever come against the Greylock family. The mountain patriarch had built a shield of protection through calculated generosity, using corruption not only to insulate his crimes, but to offer solutions to problems no one else wanted to touch. This complicity wasn't limited to the courts. Local churches which should have championed child welfare had been quietly influenced as well. The Greylocks were regular donors. Some ministers even assisted in placing children with the family, convinced they were facilitating acts of Christian charity. To the public, the Greylocks were the model of moral mountain living, hardworking, pious, financially sound. That image made them perfect stewards for orphans and troubled youth, at least in the eyes of a society eager to outsource its moral responsibilities. What chilled Piton most was the realization that this system wasn't new. it was generational. As he questioned older residents in surrounding communities, some cautiously admitted that families had sent children to the Greylocks during hard times. But they always repeated the same narrative: the children had moved on. To good jobs, the arrangements were fair, and the Greylocks had been a godsend. No one wanted to dig deeper. No one questioned where those children really went. Piton began to understand the horrifying truth. He wasn't dealing with a single crime or even a single family. He had uncovered a self-sustaining social system, one that handled unwanted children by disappearing them while rewarding those who helped keep the silence. As he traced the roots of the Greylock legacy, the evidence grew darker. The family's founder, Jeremiah Greylock, had arrived in the region in the 1830s with an unusually large number of children already classified as bound servants or apprentices. Census records from the 1840s and 50s showed a fluctuating roster of minors in the Greylock home children, who would appear briefly, then disappear without explanation. This was no coincidence. The system had been in place for decades, refined over generations. Fragments from neighboring family records hinted at what happened to children who disobeyed or proved unsuitable. Some were said to have run away, seeking work in the cities, but these stories often collapsed under scrutiny. The disappearances almost always occurred during winter, when travel was dangerous or impossible. Belongings were mysteriously left behind: favorite dolls, family Bibles, keepsakes, items no child would willingly abandon. There were no footprints in the snow, no sightings along the roads, just absence. Bone Creek Hollow itself seemed designed to conceal such horrors. The terrain was riddled with natural hiding places, deep caves, collapsed mines, ravines, so remote a search would be futile. Local hunters sometimes reported strange bone fragments or shreds of clothing in the wilderness, but these findings were quickly dismissed as the work of predators or accidents. No one wanted to suggest anything darker. In a land where silence was survival, mystery became convenience. And the Greylocks had mastered both. By the fall of 1888, Henry Peton had compiled a devastating body of evidence, testimonies, court records, and most damning of all, that haunting photograph of 17 shackled children. But what he held was more than just proof of isolated abuse. It was a window into a 50-year legacy of systematic child exploitation, hidden in plain sight and protected by a web of silence, complicity, and deeply rooted corruption spanning counties and generations. Yet even overwhelming evidence was not enough. Piton's greatest obstacle remained finding authorities brave enough and free enough from the Greylocks' influence to take action against a criminal network that had operated unchallenged for decades. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. News of Piton's quiet inquiries had traveled through the informal word-of-mouth channels that stitched together the scattered mountain communities. Eventually it reached Cincinnati, where a woman named Sarah Miller had been living under an assumed identity. Her real name was Sarah Kellerman. Born in 1851, she had grown up in Bone Creek Hollow. Her family had once been neighbors of the Greylocks, and when her parents died of typhoid in 1863, 12-year-old Sarah and her two younger brothers were placed under Ezekiel Greylock's guardianship, at the time a seemingly legitimate and merciful arrangement. What followed would shape every year of Sarah's life. She spent 6 long, harrowing years in the Hollow before escaping in 1869. When she met with Peton in December 1888, her testimony blew apart whatever illusions remained. The shackled children in the photograph she revealed were only the surface. Beneath that image lay a sprawling, calculated system built on child labor, engineered starvation, psychological control, and what she described without hesitation as organized breeding. According to Sarah, the Greylocks hadn't just stumbled into cruelty. They had refined it. The iron shackles were for children who tried to escape or resisted authority. Most didn't need chains. They were broken down more subtly. Chronic hunger left them too weak to travel. Psychological manipulation convinced them they were worthless, unwanted by the world beyond the mountains. A strict regime of punishments and meager rewards fostered competition, not camaraderie, ensuring the children turned on one another, rather than unite against their captors. Even the compound's design reflected this system of control. What Peyton had taken for dormitories were in fact disguised prisons. The children slept in sealed windowless buildings, doors locked from the outside. Siblings were separated. Friends deliberately kept apart to prevent bonds that could lead to coordinated rebellion. Food was rationed with cruel precision, just enough to sustain labor, never enough to allow strength for escape. The constant gnawing hunger drove children to fight each other for crumbs, eroding all possibility of solidarity. But Sarah's most horrifying revelation lay in the Greylocks' long-term vision. They didn't merely exploit the children, they bred them. Teenage girls among the bound were systematically paired with older boys or selected men forced into producing the next generation of captive laborers. These second-generation children were raised entirely within the hollow. They had never seen the outside world, never heard of rights laws or freedom. They were in every sense bred for submission. Some were kept illiterate, deliberately denied knowledge of anything beyond their labor. They couldn't imagine escape because they didn't know a world existed beyond the hollow's ridges. And in this ignorance, they became the Greylocks' most valuable asset workers, who required no chains because they had never known choice. Sarah had survived only because of the timing of her placement. She had memories of parents, of school, of affection. She understood in some small way that her world inside the hollow was a lie. Over the course of months, she planned her escape with quiet desperation. She rationed stolen food. She studied the hidden mountain paths. And in the dead of winter, 1869, during a blinding snowstorm that concealed her flight, she slipped into the frozen wilderness, gambling everything on the hope that something better existed beyond the mountains. She was right. But she had carried the trauma of Bone Creek Hollow with her ever since. And now, with Peyton at her side, she was ready to bring the truth into the light. Even more horrifying than the system itself was Sarah Kellerman's account of what happened to children the Greylocks deemed unfit. Those who were too sick, too rebellious, or simply surplus to the family's labor needs didn't just vanish, they were executed. Systematically. Publicly. Sarah had watched her younger brother Thomas die after he tried to signal a passing traveler for help. Ezekiel Greylock had ordered him drowned in the frozen waters of Bone Creek. The surviving children were forced to watch as Thomas struggled beneath the ice, his body eventually consumed by the current and hidden until spring thaw. It wasn't punishment. It was performance. These executions were designed to educate through terror. Children were beaten to death in the open, strangled with ropes, while others were made to stand nearby or thrown into freezing water as screams echoed through the valley. Each killing sent a message: disobedience meant death. The killings crushed rebellion, reinforced control, and turned the remaining children into silent, compliant laborers. And it worked. Sarah's testimony also exposed the wider scope of the Greylock enterprise. Their wealth didn't just come from forced labor. It was built atop a criminal empire that included theft, fraud, and what we would now call human trafficking. Children with particular talents or physical traits were sold off to other criminal operations in distant states, bringing in money that helped expand the family's influence and fund bribes to local officials. The Greylocks also preyed on struggling mountain families. They'd offer help loans, seed livestock, then slowly tighten their grip. Debtors would lose land tools, animals, and eventually their children. What began as aid turned into ownership. Over 5 decades, these tactics made the Greylocks one of the richest families in the region, all while maintaining the appearance of simple, hard-working mountain farmers. But the most chilling revelation came when Sarah described what she had heard from other captive children. Some spoke of other hollows, other families, other names, but the same system. Forced labor, fear, isolation, the same structures, the same silence, the same threats. The implication was clear. Bone Creek Hollow wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a hidden network of organized exploitation spread across Appalachia. By the end of 1888, Peyton understood the enormity of what he had uncovered. This wasn't just a single family's crimes, it was one of the most extensive cases of systemic child abuse in American history. But the very size and longevity of the operation made it nearly impossible to prosecute. Too many powerful people had been complicit. Too many institutions had turned away. The corruption was embedded, calcified. Peyton would need more than truth. He would need to fight an entire system. Armed with Sarah's testimony, he spent the early months of 1889 trying to build a legal case strong enough to pierce the wall of protection around the Greylocks. But then came the letter. In February 1889, Sarah received it at her Cincinnati home. The handwriting was crude but careful. It read, "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband, Charles Miller, and your daughter, Emma. Mountain justice has a long memory, and family debts are never forgotten. Some secrets should stay buried in the hollow where they belong." There was no signature. Just a rough sketch of a mountain laurel, the flower from which the Greylocks took their name. The message was unmistakable. She was being watched. And she wasn't safe. That single letter shattered any remaining illusion that the Greylocks were a contained threat. They had reach. They had surveillance. They had a system for tracking down those who escaped and perhaps silencing them. If Sarah had been found, who else had? Were other survivors taken back? Had some simply vanished, quietly erased before their stories could be told? For the first time, Peyton understood he wasn't just chasing justice. He was racing against a clock, against a predator that had survived exposure for generations by knowing when to strike and how to disappear. The Greylocks were still out there, and they weren't finished. Henry Peyton acted quickly. After the threatening letter arrived, he relocated Sarah Kellerman and her family to a secure location. But he was determined to uncover how the Greylocks had found her. The answer came through marriage and birth records in Ohio. Several government clerks reported receiving inquiries about Sarah under both her maiden name and her alias, Sarah Miller. These inquiries came from individuals claiming to be long-lost relatives seeking a reunion and were accompanied by small bribes for information. It had worked. The Greylocks now knew where she lived, who she'd married, and even the name of her daughter. This revelation was chilling. If the Greylocks had the resources to trace a former captive across state lines, then they could just as easily be monitoring Peyton's entire investigation. He began to suspect that his efforts, his questions, his visits, even his interviews had been silently reported back to Bone Creek Hollow. That suspicion turned to certainty when in March 1889, he returned to his Charleston studio to find it had been searched. Nothing was missing. No sign of forced entry. But his papers had been handled, his safe unlocked. And on his desk sat a single mountain laurel blossom, its petals wilting, its meaning unmistakable. The Greylocks were watching. If you thought you had already glimpsed the darkest part of this story, what came next would bury those shadows even deeper. As Peyton scrambled to secure evidence and protect his sources, reports began to surface from the mountains themselves. Travelers near Bone Creek Hollow noticed disturbing changes. Groups of men moving through the woods at night, construction sounds echoing from the valley, and armed guards stationed along hidden forest trails. Local merchants noted a shift in the family's purchases: barrels of preserved food, crates of ammunition, stockpiles of medical supplies, and large quantities of building materials suitable for fortification. The Greylocks were preparing for something. A siege, perhaps, or worse. Then those who had dared speak to Piton began facing retribution. A former county clerk who admitted to taking Greylock bribes watched his barn burn to the ground. A merchant who revealed suspicious purchasing patterns had his store ransacked, only financial records were taken. A minister who questioned the family's child placements found himself visited by strange men asking about his family, his schedule, his children. The intimidation campaign was precise, calculated, and coordinated. The Greylocks weren't just a remote mountain family. They were a syndicate. Even more disturbing was the reaction of federal authorities. When Piton hoped for support, what he got instead were warnings. U.S. Marshals questioned his motives, seemed more concerned with his disruptions than the Greylock crimes. Quietly, they made it clear Ezekiel Greylock had long served as an informant. His knowledge of the Appalachian criminal underworld had proven too valuable to risk losing. Exposing him would jeopardize ongoing federal investigations into other targets. In other words, the Greylocks were being protected not despite their crimes, but because of them. By spring 1889, Piton found himself in a waking nightmare. His pursuit of justice had uncovered a sprawling conspiracy reaching into every level of law enforcement. The photograph that launched his investigation was no longer just a record of abuse. It had become evidence of a nation's systemic failure to protect its most vulnerable. And just when the weight of the truth seemed unbearable, things got worse. In April, 3 more children disappeared from remote Appalachian communities. All signs pointed to Greylock involvement. Despite the scrutiny, the family wasn't retreating. They were expanding boldly, confidently, under the shield of their well-maintained alliances. Piton was running out of time, and the mountain continued to consume its children. Then the story broke wide open. On the night of May 15th, 1889, a boy named Michael Brennan escaped from Bone Creek Hollow. He traveled 27 miles across rugged terrain, avoiding guards' traps and freezing streams until he reached the town of Cedar Ridge. What made his arrival miraculous wasn't just the journey, it was that Michael had been born in the hollow. For 14 years, he had never set foot outside it. He knew nothing of towns or trains, only labor, hunger, and silence. And now he had come carrying more than scars. He had come with proof. Michael's arrival triggered an immediate crisis. Unlike previous runaways, he couldn't be dismissed as troubled or dishonest. He brought maps, hand-drawn blueprints of the Greylock compound. Lists of names, ages, and origins of children still held captive. Tokens taken from the dead Lockett's initials etched in metal toys. Mothers had reported missing alongside their vanished children. His physical condition was damning. Michael's body was a ledger of abuse, old fractures branding scars, emaciation. But what stunned authorities was his composure. He described the inner workings of the hollow with chilling clarity: how children were sorted, who was punished, and why where bodies were buried. He recalled the names of victims who matched missing persons reports from counties across 3 states. His knowledge was precise and intimate because he had been forced to help manage it. Michael had been a record keeper. Literate and obedient, he was tasked with cataloging arrivals' disappearances and the breeding of second-generation captives. Over time, he had secretly recorded what he saw. The photograph Piton had taken in 1887, he revealed, was only a sliver of the truth. By the time of Michael's escape, the Greylock compound held 47 children and young adults, some recently abducted, others born into bondage and never shown the sky beyond the valley's rim. What drove him to escape was even more horrifying. He had discovered that the family planned to clean house that summer. With Paton's investigation gaining traction, the Greylocks feared exposure. Their solution was brutal. They would kill the captives and burn the compound, claiming a disease outbreak had forced a mass cremation. Then they would vanish westward beyond the reach of any lingering laws. Michael's escape came just in time. The final confrontation had begun not with a raid or a court case, but with one boy's desperate, miraculous gamble for freedom. And with his testimony, the mountain silence was finally broken. What had been hidden for decades in the shadow of Bone Creek Hollow was about to face the light. The Greylock family had relocated their operations before, but never on the scale they planned in 1889. Michael Brennan had overheard Ezekiel calmly discussing how to eliminate 47 human beings efficiently while leaving no trace. It was in that moment the boy realized that escape was no longer just a dream. It was the only chance to survive. Armed with Michael's harrowing testimony, Sheriff James Rutledge, finally shaken from years of hesitation, moved to act. But he knew the Greylocks' influence ran deep. Local law enforcement had been compromised for decades, and even a whisper of a planned raid could tip off the family. Secrecy was paramount. Rutledge assembled a task force consisting of federal marshals from outside the region, hand-picked civilian volunteers, and only the most trusted local deputies. It was a delicate operation, built not just for justice, but to outmaneuver a criminal empire. The raid on Bone Creek Hollow began at dawn on June 3rd, 1889. What the team found exceeded even their worst fears. The compound had indeed been engineered for exploitation, yet its size, complexity, and history stunned everyone. Beyond the 47 living captives, they uncovered mass graves filled with the remains of children, some skeletal, some partially preserved in the cold soil stretching back over half a century. Ledger books chronicled it all: names, dates, punishments, purchases, deaths. The Greylocks had run their atrocities like a business, cold, methodical, and stunningly organized. Restraint devices, torture, implements, locked barracks. Every building in the hollow told a story of suffering. But what chilled the investigators most were the documents that pointed beyond Bone Creek Hollow. Correspondence revealed an extensive network operating across 7 states. Letters described the transfer and sale of children techniques for maintaining control and step-by-step instructions for manipulating officials. This wasn't just a family, it was part of a secret, sprawling economy of human exploitation. The confrontation itself was eerily quiet. As the raiding party approached, the Greylocks stood waiting. Ezekiel, now in his 60s but still radiating calculated control, welcomed the officers as if they were expected guests. With unnerving calm, he claimed that everything they would find was authorized, that the Greylocks had been operating under federal sanction, helping deal with unmanageable or unwanted cases in rural America. He even presented forged documentation bearing the names of real officials, crafted with just enough plausibility to raise hesitation. It might have worked if not for Michael Brennan. The boy's knowledge of the compound was precise. He led authorities to records Ezekiel had tried to conceal rooms intended for destruction and escape tunnels rigged for sabotage. He revealed that the Greylocks had planned to burn the compound once the investigation concluded, using strategically placed barrels of lamp oil to ignite a chain reaction that would destroy everything, including the children. Most damning of all, investigators found evidence that the captives had been poisoned that very morning. The goal had been mass death disguised as disease. Another Greylock deception, a convenient way to erase witnesses before vanishing west. Thanks to Michael, the poisoning was interrupted and most of the victims survived. But the plan showed the full extent of the family's depravity. Even in the face of exposure, they prioritized erasing evidence over saving lives. The trials that followed became a watershed moment in West Virginia history. Ezekiel Greylock and his inner circle were convicted on charges ranging from murder and kidnapping to conspiracy and human trafficking. But the case didn't end there. The evidence led investigators to a vast web of complicity. 12 county officials, 6 judges, and numerous law enforcement personnel were implicated in either turning a blind eye or actively assisting the Greylocks. The resulting prosecutions took over 3 years and shattered the political and legal infrastructure across 4 counties. Still, justice came at a price. The rescued children, especially those born in the Hollow, posed a heartbreaking dilemma. Many had no legal identity, no memory of life before captivity, and no surviving family to reclaim them. Reunification efforts were largely futile. Time, trauma, and silence had erased too much. And for those who had known nothing but bondage, the outside world was alien and terrifying. Worse still was the psychological damage. Years of malnutrition, fear conditioning, and abuse had left deep scars. Some children flinched at sunlight. Others refused to sleep indoors. A few tragically couldn't be saved. Institutions took in the survivors, but few were equipped to handle the complex aftermath of generational captivity. The Hollow hadn't just imprisoned their bodies, it had broken their minds. What began with a single photograph in the winter of 1887 ended with one of the most disturbing revelations in American history. A decades-long conspiracy of silence sanctioned by indifference and built on the backs of forgotten children. And yet the final truth may never be known. Many of the names in the Greylock ledgers had no matching records. Some bones were too old to identify, and some voices were silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. Still, the photograph remained a frozen testament to suffering survival and the darkness that can grow in forgotten places when no one is watching. The children rescued from Bone Creek Hollow bore wounds no one knew how to heal. Their behavior, their silence, the vacant way they looked at the world, these were trauma responses far beyond the understanding of late 19th century medicine. Many couldn't adapt to life outside captivity. Some required lifelong institutional care. Others disappeared back into the mountains, drawn by the only world they'd ever known. Their stories lost once again in the hollows of Appalachia. Michael Brennan, the boy whose courage had shattered decades of silence, became a national symbol of both heroism and heartbreak. Though he built a new life in Pennsylvania as a teacher and advocate for child welfare reform, he never escaped the shadow of Bone Creek. The guilt followed him for the ones he couldn't say, for the years he remained silent, and for the horrors he was forced to remember. Henry Peaton's photograph, the one that started it all, was entered into evidence during the Greylock trials. The image of 17 barefoot children in the snow, bound in iron, became one of the most powerful artifacts in American legal history. It forced the public to confront a terrifying truth. Atrocities like these weren't confined to distant lands or imagined pasts. They were here, hidden behind polite facades and protected by silence, corruption, and willful ignorance. The fallout from the Bone Creek Hollow case extended far beyond the courtroom. The investigation revealed a disturbing possibility that similar operations were quietly functioning across other remote regions of the country, protected by the same dangerous cocktail of isolation, fear, and institutional failure. In response, federal legislation was passed to tighten oversight of child placement systems and penalize officials who ignored signs of abuse. But enforcement in rural America remained inconsistent. Justice, it seemed, depended on geography. Even worse, many children who had been sold to other criminal enterprises before the raid were never found. The Greylock records showed dozens transferred to networks in the Western Territories, places where the rule of law was weaker, the distances greater, and the shadows longer. Most vanished forever. The true scope of the Greylock family's crimes may never be fully known. After the trials, Bone Creek Hollow was abandoned. Nature slowly overtook the buildings, burying the evidence in vines, moss, and silence. The local community, shamed and shaken by what had happened in their own backyard, chose forgetting over remembrance. The hollow returned to stillness, but now it was the silence of guilt, not secrecy. Sarah Kellerman, whose brave testimony had helped convict the Greylocks, never fully recovered from reliving her captivity. Yet she devoted the rest of her life to helping find missing children. Driven by grief for those she left behind, and by a fierce resolve to ensure no other child endured what she had, she played a key role in the establishment of America's first missing persons databases, pioneering efforts that shaped modern child protection systems. The Greylock case became more than a tale of one family's evil. It became a mirror reflecting the darkest potential of a society that fails to protect its most vulnerable. It showed what happens when communities choose comfort over truth, when power is left unchecked, and when silence is safer than speaking out. But it also proved that even the most entrenched systems of cruelty can be dismantled by a single photograph, a boy who dared to flee, and a society that finally opened its eyes. That photograph, taken in the cold of 1887, in a moment of instinct and courage, now hangs in the West Virginia State Archives. The 17 children stare out from the frame, frozen in time, bearing witness to the suffering they endured and the justice they finally received. Their presence ensures that what happened in Bone Creek Hollow will never be forgotten. The story of Bone Creek is one of the darkest chapters in American history, but also one of hope. It reminds us that the greatest horrors aren't hidden by monsters or curses, but by human fear, human greed, and human silence. And that sometimes it takes only one person refusing to look away to change everything. What do you think? Could something this horrific really remain hidden for so long? Leave a comment and tell us your thoughts. If this story gave you chills, share it with someone who loves true horror. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because the next mystery might be even darker. We'll see you in the next video.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.